Welcome back. As Sandra continued her drive along Damascus Way, she found that it was more difficult to keep her car on the road. The snow flurries grew more intense, and the traffic was much heavier than before. She passed a sign saying, Minnesota Expressway, 20 miles. She was hopeful that when she got there, the road would be much wider than Damascus Way. After further thought, she was sure of it.
How silly of me. After all, it is the expressway. Of course it should be wider,
she continued to think. Before Sandra could get to the expressway, she almost lost control of her vehicle amidst the wintry conditions. The scary thing for Sandra as she drove along was the absence of guardrails that kept vehicles from tumbling down an embankment toward the ravine several feet below the road on both sides. After the deer incident, it seemed to be smooth sailing for Sandra despite the continued poor weather conditions. She had decreased her speed after almost losing control of her car a few miles back. Snow was all around her on the grasses and trees of a heavily forested area off the road on both sides. With below freezing temperatures, the road itself was free of any accumulation. The below freezing temperatures caused another problem, the formation of what is known as black ice, something that could be extremely dangerous to motorists who drive over it. Because usually it cannot easily be seen by the naked eye, driving over a patch of dry ice could easily cause a motorist to lose control of the vehicle. Sandra remembered studying about the black ice phenomenon when she took the driver's exam to get her license. She did remember from her training not to apply her brakes if her car skidded on an ice-covered surface, to avoid the brakes locking up and the motorist losing control of the vehicle. As Sandra approached that fork in the road that led to the expressway, she came near the end of Damascus Way, where there was an overpass extending high above the Mississippi River. That's when suddenly her car began to swirl. Sandra had driven over a spot of black ice. At that point, Sandra did the unthinkable. Unlike her encounter with the deer a few miles back, she panicked and applied the brakes, action she thought would help her regain control of her vehicle. But the opposite thing happened. The wheels of her car became locked, and the vehicle continued to skid off the side of the road just prior to her vehicle reaching the overpass. Within a split second, she noticed a steep embankment that her car was heading towards. Then she screamed,
"Oh my God! I'm going down! Help me, God!"
Now she was unable to control the car, and it soon began to skid down the embankment into a ravine. Sandra was conscious of seeing tree branches and brush scraping against her windows as her car tumbled down the embankment. There was a screeching sound that was so loud she couldn't hear herself think. Sandra didn't remember anything else after that. Soon, Sandra's car would be several feet below the road, finally coming to a rest at the bottom of the ravine not far from the river. During the horrendous accident, Sandra became tucked inside her car and unconscious, unaware of where she had ended up. She didn't remain there long in that unconscious state, as emergency personnel soon came to give assistance. It was a challenging situation for them, largely because the vehicle was not easily accessible. Because the vehicle had become lodged among the trees and brush of the forest, not to mention having to navigate through tons of accumulated snow covering the ground, made rescue efforts very difficult. Soon, after getting into the vehicle, attendants carefully took Sandra out of the vehicle and carried her to a waiting ambulance. Then she was rushed to receive medical care. Now, Sandra was with paramedics who would take her to a local hospital where she would be looked after by health professionals. She would eventually regain consciousness. Thank goodness another motorist had seen the accident happen and immediately called for help. Now in a local hospital, Sandra's next conscious moment involved facing a crew of doctors and other attendants.
"Where am I?"
she asked, seeming to be floating in and out of consciousness. "Miss Hughes," one of the doctors addressed her formally.
"Yes, doctor. Let me know my situation."
Then he went on to describe her condition. "Well, we have some good news for you and some bad news. First, the bad news is that your legs were crushed severely. But the good news is that during emergency surgery, we were able to reconnect all of the veins and arteries in that area of your body, and we were also able to mend the bones in your legs that were crushed and broken." The doctor further explained, "You will eventually be able to walk normally, but you will need a wheelchair at first. Then, after your legs regain some strength, you will only need the use of crutches for a few weeks. After that, with continued rehab, you will be able to walk again, but you'll have a slight limp until the area becomes completely healed." Sandra felt overwhelmed by the news. Then she responded by saying to the attending physician, with a bit of sarcasm,
"So the good news is that I'll be in a wheelchair? Is that what you're saying, doctor? Is that what you're saying? My legs were crushed? Oh my God, I'll be a cripple. And you tell me there's some good news?"
Sandra desperately desired for the doctor to give her more encouraging news, but it was news that the doctor did not have to give her. She continued to repeat some of what she heard already being said by the doctors, largely in derision and with tears freely flowing down her cheeks.
I'm a cripple. I'm a cripple."
The doctors tried to calm her. "No, Miss Hughes. As we said, with proper rehab, you'll be walking fine again in a few months," one of them said. Sandra grudgingly accepted the doctor's prognosis, and she did begin to calm herself. Accepting the reality of the situation, she began to prepare mentally to do whatever was necessary to get better. Needless to say, Sandra was devastated by the news. She paid attention only on the difficulties ahead of her, instead of realizing how fortunate she was just to have survived the accident. When Sandra was ready to leave the hospital, a medical assistant indicated they had a charter plane available to take her home, where she could then work on her rehabilitation. As Sandra spent a little more time in the hospital, she tried to be positive, saying to herself,
"I'll be back on my feet in no time."
Yes, Sandra was intent on completing her recovery. She would patiently accept her rehabilitation. What she couldn't be patient about was her continued desire to see Fred. She had already called Maggie to tell her about her accident. Sandra figured that Maggie would call and tell Fred the news about her condition, and upon doing that, Fred would be compelled to come and see her. After talking with Sandra, Maggie did call Fred to inform him of what happened. When Maggie told him of Sandra's accident, Fred's response was predictable. He was stunned to hear that news and responded with a series of questions. "Sandra? In an accident? Wow. Well, how is she? Is she all right?" Then Maggie answered him and said, "I think so, Fred, but maybe you should contact her since you two are right there in Minneapolis. I'm sure she'll be glad to hear from you." "Well, okay, Mag, and thanks for the information, and I'll be seeing you when I get back," Fred said to his wife. After learning of Sandra's accident, Fred did contact her. Soon she would get the opportunity to talk to him firsthand before taking her trip back to Detroit. Fred arranged to leave his conference and go pay Sandra a visit. He soon arrived at the hospital where she was. After learning of her location there, Fred went to her room and entered. When Sandra saw him walk in, she immediately perked up, being temporarily relieved of her depression. She said to him,
"Hello, Fred. I didn't think we'd see each other with me in this position. I'm really surprised to see you."
"Hello, Sandra. Mag called me and told me about what happened, and I was so sorry to hear about your accident. Yeah, Meg gave me some of the details. But listen, just follow the doctor's orders and you'll be fine."
"Oh, thank you, Fred. And why are you way over there? You could come over here and sit on the bed, and I can give you more of the details, and I won't have to scream."
"Well, okay." As Fred got closer to Sandra, he could smell the aroma of a fragrance that was unfamiliar to him. She then grabbed his hand and explained how she felt.
"Fred, I'm so fortunate to be alive. When I went down that embankment on the Damascus Way, I thought that I was a goner. I just blanked out and don't remember anything else until I woke up here at the hospital."
"Yes, Sandra. Like I said, Mag gave me some of those same details of what happened. And let me tell you, you were really fortunate to have gotten through that situation."
"Well, Fred, I'm not totally out of the woods yet. I have quite a bit of rehab to do."
"I know, Sandra. And that's why it's important that you follow doctor's orders. And remember, I'll be there for you." Sandra interpreted those last few words from Fred, that he would be there for her, as a license to continue her devious pursuit of him. The accident and Sandra's resulting injuries did not diminish her desire to be with Fred. Unfortunately, in her case, unlike the Damascus Road story told in the Bible, Sandra's Damascus Way experience did not result in a total change of her spirit. Yes, God may knock on our door at some point in our lives, with a desire for us to open it and let him in. Our actions behind that door may be in the form of coming against God's kingdom through the persecution of the saints, like Saul before he was converted and became the Apostle Paul, or through the satisfying of the flesh, like Sandra. But it is up to us to open the door and let him in when God speaks to us. Saul responded and opened the door to his spirit when God spoke to him on the Damascus Road. But Sandra's misfortune did not result in a similar response from her. She apparently did not turn from her wicked ways because of the accident she experienced. While she desired physical healing, her door was still closed spiritually because she continued to have a desire to be with Fred. Meanwhile, Fred would soon leave the hospital to complete the attendance at his conference and then return home to Chicago. As for Sandra, she soon would leave Minneapolis as well, going back home to Detroit and to recuperate from her injuries, and most likely to continue to think about being with Fred. Well, that's all for today. In closing, I'd like to say, and would like you to remember, that whatever you may be going through, whether it's good or bad, just keep in mind that there's always more good things coming your way. We'll see you the next time.